Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Max Melman here at Case Western Reserve University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Zaremski Forum. The Zaremski Forums are made possible by a generous endowment by Miles Zaremski and his wife, Elena. Miles is a 1973 graduate of our law school. And we're very fortunate today to have with us John Culhane and Joseph Ferris and students Tracy Baker and Dylan Mockensturm. John Culhane is the H. Albert Young Fellow in Constitutional Law, Professor of Law, and co-director of the Family Health Law and Policy Institute at Delaware Law School, Widener University, and visiting professor of law at the Beasley Law School at Temple University. And he teaches in the areas of constitutional law, public health law, torts, and family law. Joining him is Joseph Ferris, the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and an adjunct faculty member at the Delaware Law School of Widener University. And they will introduce our student presenters, I should say, for their presentation today on teaching public health law and inequality. So thank you, everyone. At the end of the webinar, I will post the information for CLE credit. You'll see the activity code that you have to use. And after the presentations, we should have time for some questions and questions from the audience. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A. You'll see that button at the bottom of your screen. And I will try to get to it. And I apologize in advance if there are too many questions and we don't have time to take all of them. But we'll do our best. Okay. Thank you very much. John, take over.
Yes, I would like to begin, first of all, by welcoming everyone to the webinar and by thanking Max Melman, whom I've known through health law circles for probably decades, right? And who was gracious enough to invite us to speak today. So I'd like to start by thanking Max. Also, thanks to Patty Harbaugh for all of her work over the last several months to keep me on track and make sure that this happened. And of course, to Martin Araska for his able technical assistance. Joseph will introduce himself more fully, but he and I have been co-teaching a course in public health law and inequality, and also with me today, this semester, it's ongoing. And also with us today are two of the students chosen not exactly at random from our public health law course, who have been among the most enthusiastic and interested participants in the course over the semester. And they may say a sentence or two about themselves when they speak, but Tracy Baker is a third-year evening division student and will be graduating next year and has a rich background in all kinds of things, but including health law and practice. And Dylan Mockensturm, this is his repeat offender, was in my family law class last semester and is now in this class. And Dylan, you're graduating, am I right?
In 2 months.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So it's extra special to get a student about to graduate who's willing not only to show up but to put on a tie. So thanks to both of you and thanks to everyone for attending. So what we're going to do today, we have a couple of goals and a couple of things we'd like to accomplish. So one is to kind of explain how we got here, how we got to this course of public health law and inequality, and this will be kind of a back and forth between Joseph and me. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of the course, the specifics, some of the pedagogy and some of the course content that we've created. And the presentation has a couple of goals, one of which, though, probably the most important one, is to tell you all how diversity, equity, and inclusion issues can be integrated kind of organically and we hope seamlessly into a public health law course. As we think more creatively and expansively about public health law and about DEI, it's incumbent on us to come up with courses like this and content like this. So let me begin, again, going back a couple of decades when I first began teaching a course in a particular subtopic of public health law. And this was my HIV/AIDS in the law class, which probably goes back, I didn't count the years because it's too depressing, but it probably goes back 25 years or so. And I originally approached the course from kind of a tort professor perspective, and about liability issues. And as I delved not even too deeply into the issues, I came to recognize that really, obviously it was a public health law course, and that's where I placed the center of the class. And the reason I mention is obviously the class evolved over the years into the public health law course, and now public health law and inequality. But the reason I mention this history is that as soon as I started looking into HIV in the law, the inequality issues are kind of inescapable, right? So you're talking about a virus that initially primarily infected gay men. There were also blood transfusions, but the stigmatized group was gay men, and then marginalized group, and then over time, as the course of infection changed, it ended up that poorer people and especially sort of other even more marginalized groups like IV drug users, women of color who were perhaps with men who were not fully acknowledging their sexuality, also became, it sort of migrated in that direction. And it made me think, and I started reading things by the justly famous health law scholar, Jonathan Mann, who talked about sort of inequality in HIV, but also in public health more generally. And so this came to kind of inform my whole approach to public health and public health law. And there are all kinds of issues around inequality that not only inform our discussion of HIV in the law, but as we'll be discussing over the course of this presentation, virtually every area of law. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. And obviously the topics, as you'll see, have changed over the years as different public health threats, challenges, and possibilities have emerged. So I wanted to sort of stop there for a minute and let Joseph come in and talk about his DEI perspective and what that brings to the course.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. So I'll just jump right in and just kind of connect to some of the comments John had made. So going back a couple of years in 2020, the Delaware Law School was presented with some demands from some Black alumni and some students to do more in the area of DEI. And as a result of that, the law school had positioned itself to be more in front of DEI issues and to be a bit more engaging. And as a result of that, the law school developed and implemented a DEI strategic plan. And as part of that plan, a DEI committee comprised of faculty, administrators, students, and alumni was formed to kind of put together some strategy, some programming, and collaborate on how to engage the DEI areas. In addition to that, the school crafted a value statement around DEI and really focusing on the law school being an anti-racist institution, educating with purpose to teach about racial justice issues, as well as just broader, equitable, and inclusive issues as it affects the law and society. And in addition to the strategic plan, the value statement, the DEI committee, the the school created a DEI dean position, which I'm in that inaugural role. I was practicing for the last couple of years prior to moving into this role in the areas of bankruptcy, corporate, intellectual property, mergers and acquisitions. But I'm also an alum of the school. And so when I saw the opportunity and it connected to a number of other interests, I threw my hat in the ring, so to speak, to indicate my interest in the position. And so now that I'm here, this DEI strategic plan is something that I'm using as a backdrop to guide me in, developing and building this role. And a number of things connecting to this strategic plan is training for the student body, training for faculty and staff, looking holistically at policies and practices related to curriculum, related to admissions, related to areas and support for bar passage, and areas related to hiring, just to name a few. And more specifically, to connect to the DEI curriculum aspect, there is an ongoing review about how to comprehensively incorporate DEI topics into the curriculum across the board. But in addition to that, there has been efforts to identify courses that may already exist that are specifically connected to DEI area, as well as to develop additional courses. So this public health law and inequality course is one that John and I had kind of been considering over last semester with, the idea of bringing in some more DEI relevant topics and conversations that connect to issues that students are interested in. And we were having conversations about how to best integrate the topics of public health law and inequality, and also ways for giving students a better understanding to more comprehensively, connect with how public health interacts and how decisions at its best may exacerbate health issues, and at its worst make those issues much worse, right? And then one other aspect that we really thought about was to give students a greater appreciation with how DEI issues connect on a deeper level beyond what some students had thought about in the past. And so John and I were looking to be collaborative. As he mentioned, he focused more from like pulling from a torts background. And for me, I was more broadly looking at issues that were in the public discourse, socially, politically, as well as historically, related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, related to anti-racism, whether it's pulling in immigration, whether it's pulling in how different laws have historically impacted various communities, Native Americans, Black communities, in particular, Latin American communities. And so in that collaborative approach, we look to kind of integrate aspects of public health law and inequality together. And John is going to talk about some of the topics, but as he starts to do that, initially, while looking at the landscape of articles, looking at what existed even in law, there is so much material out there written, whether it's about bias in the medical field, whether it's about distrust among various communities, or even effects of certain laws historically on underrepresented communities. So we thought that there was a lot of material there that we could use to develop this course.
Yeah, and what happened in the fall semester is that Joseph was talking about needing to teach another course in the spring, and it occurred to me that the course I was already teaching would be really a great vehicle for the two of us in related ways and kind of complementary ways. So Joseph is a new faculty member. I thought it might be helpful to him to co-teach a course with a more senior faculty member. And from my perspective, it provided a good opportunity, just thinking selfishly, to get to know more about these issues related to inequality and how I could better integrate those into the course, even though they had been there, and some of them had been discussed explicitly. And so public health law, among the many courses I teach, really did seem ideal, really kind of perfect for the integration of these issues, because they're basically everywhere. So what we did as sort of a hook to get people really interested in the course, public health law, is, of course, we started with COVID, right? Because that's the presenting public health issue that we are all, still very concerned about. And as anyone who's looked at any of the data on COVID can tell you, like many other, illnesses, it's not just the pathogen that you look at, right? You look at the social, the behavioral, the environmental burdens and effects of COVID. And it turns out, of course, that people in minority communities were more likely to become seriously ill and die of COVID for reasons relating to healthcare access, information, and things of that nature. And so we started with COVID, and Joseph brought some readings in right at the beginning that were designed to get students thinking maybe more systematically than I had been over the years about some of the inequality issues. So I don't know, Joseph, if you want to just talk a little bit about some of the readings. I don't mean in any depth, but just in terms of topics, implicit bias, things of that nature.
Sure. So as I was initially mentioning, cognitive bias in medical decision-making is a topic that we brought in the initial discussion. Racial differences and institutional trust is another topic. And related to that topic specifically, we learned as a class that the Native American and indigenous people had the highest level of distrust for the government and the scientific community within the United States related to a host of issues, but including vaccinations, and the push from the government and the scientific communities for people in general, and then that community specifically to receive the vaccine. And one of the, I guess, the learnings that came out of that is that the approach that the government and the scientific community particularly should take is to engage the tribal leaders and the community more emphatically as partners, to bring them into the conversation as a way of gaining that support, and as a way of being able to kind of overcome the vaccine hesitancy that's in some of those communities. Additionally, around that institutional trust and even vaccine equity conversation and vaccine hesitancy, we talked about how misinformation was a big factor in causing some pockets within the country to either delay or to hesitate in getting the vaccine. And so whether it's the CDC or the federal government or even the states enacting certain campaigns to counter that misinformation was really important. I think there was just one other point there in that broader topic with with COVID in particular. It was a conversation about personal liberty and the mask mandates in particular. And we had some conversations around that, and even highlighted a case from 1994, Benning versus Vermont, where it was a good vehicle of sorts to kind of have that conversation, come to bear with the class, to think beyond vaccines and considering, the balance of communitarian values versus liberty. And so a lot of times throughout the course, and including initially, we're talking about balancing of issues, right? Where when you think about public health law and the greater good versus kind of this individual liberty and kind of personal, rights conversation. And so these are ideas that are very relevant and important to the conversation about vaccinations and COVID. particularly.
Yeah, and speaking of vehicles, that the case of Benning versus Vermont involves a motorcycle, and this guy was complaining that the requirement of wearing a motorcycle helmet infringed on his constitutional rights. And I mentioned this only because we thought it was helpful to take a look at something that you wouldn't typically think of as a public health issue, just to kind of illuminate the complexity of balancing these various issues. And one of the things that the court did a pretty good job of in the case was kind of educating whoever was reading the case about the different values and the sort of communitarian approach to thinking about what the effect that your actions have on other people. Whether it's the cost of healthcare, whether it's the fact that somebody who hit and killed somebody else while they were on a motorcycle without a helmet would have to live with that for the rest of their lives, and just trying to think about things from a broader perspective. And then what you can do, and what we tried to do, is to take that and sort of bring that kind of public health ethical approach into the topics that we were discussing. So one of the things that you find in that public health, not only public health law, but public health practice is pretty good at when it's doing its job the right way, is identifying specific populations, which of course are always contingent and overlapping, but identifying populations and sort of targeting whatever public health messaging you're doing to those populations. Because if you don't do that, you're not likely to get, buy-in. And I'm going to give a couple of examples that will also begin to kind of tell us about the pedagogy and the topics that we covered during the course of the semester. So the first of these goes back to HIV in the law, and it turned out that the reason there was success in at least stemming the explosion of HIV infection in the gay community, particularly among the white gay community, was there was outreach to those groups in places like gay bars where people would congregate, and you could do kind of good public education. But what wasn't done well enough at the beginning was looking at other populations that might be at risk. And so this really was kind of a dramatic example of the importance of targeting, and how important, how that may affect, or does affect, I should say, the efficacy of your public health information. The other thing is when we talk about traditional public health, which is where the course still begins with COVID and vaccine, and then talking about quarantine. It turns out that there are these inequality issues all over the place when we talked about quarantine. So I'll just give a couple of examples that I think really help to illuminate for the class, as well as for Joseph and me, how some of these things kind of play out. So for instance, there is a sort of going back historically, there's a great book, which maybe not the best beach reading, but it's called Pox by Michael Wilrich. And he talks about kind of the medical social history of smallpox. And he has this whole description, which we assigned to the class, about how public health authorities were always trying to figure out, well, should they require vaccination, right? What were the costs and benefits of doing that? And then when it came to, sort of quarantining people, how were they going to do that? And if they were going to vaccinate people, how coercive were they going to be? And so we had page after page of sort of description in the book about public health authorities coming into buildings and forcibly vaccinating people, which is not the way to gain the trust of the public. So that was one example. And then in terms of quarantine, we talked about a couple of interesting cases. The most interesting of which was probably the Juho case from 1905, California District Court case, where what had essentially happened, and so here we got into the Chinese Exclusion Act and the backdrop of this case, was that public health authorities quarantined a section of the city of San Francisco in response to what they claimed was an outbreak of bubonic plague. And of course, plague was still a big deal until we had antibiotics, right? And that was the justification. But one, there was some question about whether there even was plague in the city. And two, even giving the public health authorities the benefit of the doubt that there was plague, the way the quarantine was set up, it was almost like scientifically engineered to increase the rate of infection. So people weren't quarantined to their homes. They were, if they were, it was basically cordoning off the Chinese American section of San Francisco and forbidding them from leaving. But of course, they could congregate with others and continue to spread the disease. And in case you needed more proof, the boundary around that quarantined area was kind of zigzagging so that it included the Chinese-owned homes, but not the homes that were owned by white people on the border. And the court noticed all of that and really said, you know, we usually defer to public health authorities. You know, they did this in the bathhouse cases during the AIDS epidemic. If there's a reasonable belief that this is necessary for a compelling public health reason, but, you know, the public health authorities in this case really overplayed their hand, and it's very obvious what they were doing. And it really feeds into what was happening with the Chinese American population at the time. And then real quickly, the other case that we talked about, the Kirk case from South Carolina, involved a woman who had been on a mission to Africa, came back with leprosy, and the public health authorities wanted to confine her to the pest house. I'm not making this up, that's what they called it. And the court said, you know, this is no ordinary lady. This is a lady of refinement. She was an older woman. And then the court actually said, you know, the pest house was really made for, you know, as a place to house Negroes when there was a public health threat like plague or smallpox. So you can see in these decisions kind of the what looks like it should be a kind of neutral public health tool, which is quarantine, was used in ways that were you know, clearly designed not for that purpose, or not well designed for that purpose. And courts, you know, they'll put up with a lot, but there's a limit, as those cases demonstrate. So Joseph, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that perhaps long-winded discussion of some of the material.
So not particularly for that section, but if we were to kind of move beyond the initial COVID vaccination, immunization, individual rights, and quarantine, and we were on those topics for several weeks, but then we transitioned from that to a discussion about environmental justice. And in that topic, we talked about food deserts, legislation related to environmental justice, and lack of green spaces. And I think during that conversation, so all of those things, food desert and lack of green spaces, as well as the legislation, kind of connects to some historical practices from, you know, related to whether, you know, state and federal governments around property. And there's a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that talks about racially zoned discriminatory residential practices in the US that includes racially zoned housing areas, restrictive covenants, the creation of fear of loss of property values, the practice of redlining, where they literally take a map and draw a red line around and designate and kind of aggregate Black populations into those areas and exclude them from other areas. And so similar to some of the things that John was just talking about with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and even how when they were quarantining that area, they kind of did the zigzagging approach, similar to redlining in a different way. And so the effects of that as far as it relates to public health, in a lot of those Black designated areas, there were policies that were made and practices to maybe minimize the availability of parks, or use certain building materials or even certain designs to just kind of cram people into certain spaces. So if there were diseases or illnesses, it would spread more quickly. But at the same time, in the discussion of lack of green spaces, we talked about how it connects to mental health. And so not being able to go out and see the greenery, or be able to go for a walk, or be able to have spaces to, for community or for exercise, it has negative implications for a person's mental and physical health. And so we had conversations around that, as well as food deserts in a lot of these communities. Places like Whole Foods or Wegmans isn't, they're not co-located, but they're in these sprawling areas that usually require a vehicle or car to get to. And in some of these varying other communities, there's more poverty, less access, less vehicle access, less public access, and so what's in these communities are places like fast food vendors, or little stores on the corner that don't necessarily provide fresh produce and fresh foods. And so it's processed foods, or it's, foods that are have a lot of preservatives or salt, or some, just not the same level that would promote health. And we talked about those kinds of things, and legislation. And the Biden administration, we talked about how he has some legislation that with some money behind it, that the states have to kind of take action to enact policies and procedures related to better green spaces, or policies that will create better access for, like, food, to deal with food insecurity. So I felt like that was a good transition from talking about some of the individual rights in quarantine to more broad issues related to environmental justice. One other point before we transition to another topic is that a lot of these food insecurities or lack of green space access in certain communities was made worse during the pandemic. Part of it because of the stay-at-home orders. So, in certain communities that already had limited access, to certain spaces, but then the stay-at-home edicts that were initiated, some of the families that were, the quality of the home that they were staying at, or the amount of people in that particular home, kind of compounded some of these issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that COVID brought to light, and perhaps made us and students more cognizant of, was the connection between some of these disparities and kind of the mental health issues. The other thing I would point out is another aspect of environmental justice has to do with, once you have a certain populations that are kind of crammed into certain areas, then those are also the areas that are likely to bring things like, waste dumps and toxicity to those, same communities. So that's another dimension of inequality that obviously is of substantial concern. We moved on to, and one thing I guess I'll add here is that obviously when you teach a course like public health, the topics change, right, over the years. And in different years, you might spend more time on infectious disease. It might spend more time on climate change, as we have done, recently. So there's a list that you can see on your screen, I hope, of the topics that we really emphasized this semester. And I'm thinking back, shortly after 2001, we were looking at terrorism as a public health issue. And of course, it still is one, but, trying to kind of keep the course current with the most pressing public health issues, after always getting through basic, public health ethics as applied in context, public health ethics, and the balance between liberty and community that are really well illustrated by quarantine, confinement, and immunizations. We talked some about taxation as well, which is not something that people generally think of as a public health law related issue, but of course, it has important implications. So if you tax, tobacco at suddenly at $2 more a pack, there's going to be fewer people taking up smoking. And so we talked about the efficacy of that tax and the somewhat unexpected paradoxical result that it had the least effect on the poorest communities, which was a surprise to us. The most effect or the greatest effect had to do with people at the, sort of teenagers and young adults, because they only had so much price flexibility. But people that were in an economically disadvantaged situation, poorer people, they made choices, right, to forego other things to continue smoking, which, should cause some thinking about how we do tax policy. We spent a good amount of time on the soda tax because, that is really one of the issues du jour. In Philadelphia, where I live and where many of our students come from, there is a soda tax in place. And while it looks like a great idea, and in some ways might be a great idea on paper, it has all kinds of, it raises all kinds of equality issues that we discussed at some length. And it's been very contentious in Philly and remains so. So Joseph, this is an interesting enough topic, and I think really gets into these inequality issues in a way that maybe you want to, just highlight for a minute before we move on to our last couple of topics.
Sure. And I will also invite Tracy and or Dylan to weigh in on this topic as well, if you all choose to. So in particular with the soda tax, some of the things that we talked about in particular was that the tax was designed to generate income for schools and or like daycare providers within Philadelphia in particular. But generally, these types of taxes would be covered under a general fund. And so there was a question in a discussion about why is the purpose of the tax kind of disconnected from how it's being rolled out, and really that the effect of the tax is heavier, felt on these poor communities in a number of ways. One, taxing the soda, a lot of the companies and a lot of the people who work in the city but then live outside of the city, they just go elsewhere to purchase their soda, right? And so the city isn't really getting the benefit of that tax. And then additionally, those who cannot travel outside of the community, a mile outside the city, for example, because of lack of access, lack of transportation, they're the ones paying more for the soda or the sugary beverage. And then I guess another idea is that, similar to what you were saying, John, about the tobacco, some people in this community, this is their drink of choice in the first place, so they're going to have it. So the effect of the tax is affecting them more specifically, and it's not necessarily serving the purpose. So the revenue that was intended to be generated, especially with those in the higher echelons and those with the money, they were going elsewhere to get the soda, and then those in the city are negatively affected by it. So it's almost like a double-edged sword, so to speak, in the impact of it. So maybe it was good intent, but the impact of it didn't really bear out the plan that was intended. And so that just kind of connects a bit more to the inequality and the disparate impact. And we talked about as a class that when policymakers are making decisions, that having voices from the community to participate and to weigh in would be really helpful, because a lot of times in the intended effect of a particular policy isn't necessarily what actually happens. And Tracy or Dylan, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
Or anything else that we've discussed up until now? Feel this isn't your only chance, but if you have anything you'd like to say at the moment, you've got the floor.
Well, one of the other things that we also discussed in relationship to this theme, Ferris, was that the issue with the inner city, and a lot of people were using their public welfare cards, and how we felt that the state was subsidizing some of the tax with the soda tax. So there were problematic tax schemes along with that. So that's just one of the things that came to mind.
Yeah.
I'll say for me, I mean, if we're talking about, taxation on some of these topics, one thing that came to mind was during our opioid discussion about just the kind of the way that we approach some of these different public health problems, and the way that these issues are rooted kind of in history, and that kind of colors the way that we look at them, and the big push by pharmaceutical companies to muddy up the waters around opioids and their effectiveness, and rely on bogus studies, whereas marijuana was kind of demonized early on and kind of held that stigma now, and we miss chances to tax marijuana. And one other thing I would mention, which I've discussed with both my professors, I plan to present on it next week, is that even the will of the people doesn't always make changes in these aspects, and the legislature sometimes don't enact public health policy that people want to see. So for instance, DC citizens recently voted to pass marijuana, decriminalization of marijuana in DC, and it was shot down by the legislature. Even
by Congress.
By Congress, yeah, broad support on both sides of the aisle. I think like 50% Republican support and 70-80% of Democrats. And so I just think that those are some of the issues that still face, public health solutions, is that, you have to be able to actually get the legislation done and passed, even if there's broad support. It doesn't always carry the day.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think in the interest of time and wanting to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we used in class, the pedagogical tools, and to give Dylan and Tracy a little bit more time to weigh in before Q&A, I think I'll skip, with Joseph's acquiescence, skip over a further discussion of tort law, and move on to global climate change and its effects on health. This was the subject that we covered in last night's class, actually. And one of the things that I've done in the past when I've taught the course is always to leave a little time at the end to move from kind of the domestic public health perspective to the global health perspective. And of course, it's like world music, right? I mean, you don't really do it justice by having one section of the record store, if there are still such things, that have, world music, right? And same thing with global health. It deserves its own course, of course, right? But we at least wanted to introduce the students to these broader issues, and how what we do domestically is just part of a much larger and even more complex system, right? So, you could study, domestic antitrust, and it's complicated enough, and you look at international antitrust law and you have no idea even what to do. Here we have identified the problem, at least, right? And then the question is, so we spent some time yesterday just going through how global climate change is affecting different parts of the world. And we showed some slides about the burden on places like Asia or Africa or the South Pacific, right? Or South America, Latin America, and the various challenges that, that come up there. And obviously, there are these huge health disparities that people in, the developed world are somewhat able to mitigate and to ameliorate, but people in poorer countries, right, in developing countries, don't necessarily have that same ability. and they're often the ones that are most effective. So just to give one really clear example that we just talked about very briefly, some of the indigenous people in Peru brought a claim against various multinational corporations for their role in climate change. And the argument is, we're living kind of a simple life, and we are not contributing. Our carbon footprint is pretty small, and we're being overrun and threatened by climate change that you have caused through a series of, and this is like sort of global tort law in a way, right? Your practices, your marketing, your approach to climate change, which has been, if I'm really speaking in bulk here, not that different from what the tobacco companies did in some cases, which is to, deflect and to confuse the issues. So some of that was really important for students to understand as part of the bigger picture of global health. So maybe Joseph, you want to say something, and then and I want to make sure to give Dylan and Tracy some time, and maybe they can talk a little bit about some of the things that we did in the course and what worked for them and didn't, class discussion, reflection papers, small group discussions, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think 2 points. One, going back to a comment that Dylan had made around the opioid crisis discussion. And in that topic, we really wanted to explore what the interests were with the public health imperatives and what we were trying to balance. And, specifically, we were looking at the balance between alleviating chronic pain and then preventing the abuse of those pain relief drugs and the associated societal costs and effects. So we're looking at addiction and death. We were talking about the healthcare costs and social services, the burden on community and families, and then the broader implications and effects on public safety and the criminal justice system. And then kind of the second point, segueing back to the climate change, as John was mentioning, we looked at the different effects specifically on regions based on a story map from the World Health Organization, and then more broadly, globally in general, those effects. And there were patterns that we could see across the different regions that we talked about in the class, related to the warming temperatures bringing threat of certain infectious diseases to new locations, how certain animals or species that weren't very populous in a particular area because of higher temperatures were coming into the area and maybe eating up crops or eating others sources of food supply for other animals or for people, and so causing a reduction in food, and which relates to food insecurity in the area as well. Rising sea levels that were the cause of displacement and death. So a number of communities had to move because of flooding and rising sea levels, and just that the extreme climate events are becoming more common. So one of the points to take away was that over the last 6 years, since 2015, the climate of the Earth, the average temperature has increased and has been increasing consistently since that time. And we've looked at some of those effects, related to these other topics with displacement, food insecurity, the prevalence of storms, the melting of the polar ice caps or glaciers, and how that affects our water and drought in certain areas. So these, the high level for a lot of these topics was that these issues are, they're discrete in a sense, but then they're interconnected as well, and being able to kind of present and talk about this with the students so they can see the connections, and also see how they can position themselves to be advocates, and to also position themselves for change.
Thank you. I think we probably want to get to Q&A, but first I do want to hear from Dylan and Tracy about their experience in the course. It was a new course. As I said, we used different pedagogical tools. A lot of it was class discussion, discussing reflection papers. Tracy is one of the few people writing a long paper for the course, which she will present in a few weeks. But just to hear anything you all have to say, what worked, what didn't work, although I hate to invite that, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I have one specific observation from the course. I think that being that it's a public policy course, the format of open dialogue and discussion works really well because there's not a right or wrong answer necessarily. Similarly, me and Tracy took a Reconstruction Amendments course, which was a lot of theory on the developments of those three amendments and the court's decisions on those. And it was also a very open discussion, open dialogue type setting. So I think for issues like these, we've all had exposure to public health, all of these issues. And some of us have even felt, even on, I guess on COVID is the clearest example where it connects to your real life. Everybody has an opinion on the COVID vaccine and the messaging surrounding it and the policies that have taken place. So it was, I thought that the format for the class for this specific topic on a public policy type level was very effective. So that was a highlight. No lowlights for now.
Good. If there had been, we would have muted you instantly. And now we will hear from Tracy, and then I hope there are questions, and if not, we can fill the time if we need to. Tracy.
I think what worked best for me was the small group. The fact that the course was an upper level course, of course, but that it was a smaller class size. I think there was 15 people in the class, something like that. So it did lend itself to, like what Dylan said about us having a lot of open discussion. And sometimes the discussion went completely off topic, not completely, but it really depended on what the students brought to the discussion. The professors mentioned my background and my undergraduate degree is in health policy. And so I was really interested in this course because a lot of the topics I've touched and discussed previously. So, but there were other people. I mean, I think we have a clinical specialist in the class. We have someone who sits on the board of a community health center. So we have a really eclectic mix of students with different backgrounds, and this course lent itself to them to be able to highlight their experience. We talked about, even we have students who have lived in different parts of the country, and we talked about different experiences when, for example, we talked about the COVID and people having influence. And I lived in Brooklyn, and we talked a lot about the Jewish population being able to still congregate, even though there was a quarantine in New York City. We had another student who talked about them living in Vermont and how, it was very different. So the course, like Dylan, all highlights, no lowlights.
Well, that's a relief. So it's about 12:54, and I know we have to end at 1 at the latest. Are there questions?
So let me field the questions if I may. There are a couple from the attendees. One is, do you think that the class could be scaled up to include more students without losing the discussion feeling, possibly through the use of teaching assistants or multiple instructors?
Joseph, do you want me to?
Well, I'll jump in for a minute.
Yeah.
I think there could be some scaling in a limited way. So we designed this course to be a seminar course, 2-credit course, and we initially were planning for 18 to 20 students. And so we landed at 15, and it seemed like a good fill there. But I think we could have broadened it a bit more, maybe up to 10 more students, and we would have to probably repackage the formatting just a little bit. And what I have in mind is there were a couple of classes where we had broken the class into groups and had them do some group discussions and then some report outs. So maybe a bit more of that, or John and I would have been a bit more intentional in assigning the reflection papers to have maybe a bit more of a group dynamic more than we did.
Okay. If there are no other comments on that question, I have another question. Have you had any pushback or political opposition to the course, either internally or from outside the university? And if so, how have you handled it?
I have not. And I will say that although this isn't exactly responsive, I know that other courses sometimes that folks saw as more specifically directed toward DEI issues, while they were well populated, there were some students that would ask questions like, well, why this course shouldn't even be taught, let's say critical race theory or something. And so there has been some pushback, and I'll let Joseph, obviously you're the one to talk about what the responses are to that. But for our course, as far as I know, I haven't sensed any pushback. And I think a lot of it has to do with the organic way that these inequality issues have been kind of fissured into the course. And it's hard to argue that you shouldn't consider those issues in addressing public health concerns, because the course in some aspects wouldn't make any sense.
Especially when you think about legislature, lobbyists, such as the National Rifle Association, when it came to the gun violence conversation. There's definitely political and social implications related to policy. That's just how our government and our body politic is organized. So yeah, you can't ignore it. But at the same time, within the class itself, students, faculty have different social and political views, and some of those came out in the conversation, and the dialogue and the discussion allowed and actually invited those kinds of discussions. So it wasn't held in a combative way, but at the same time, if people wanted to challenge, someone's viewpoint, even, challenge a professor's, viewpoint about a particular area, that was welcome. And, so there's this intellectual and academic, flexibility, embedded in the course. But more broadly, I'll say this, John, and to, to everyone else about that question in particular. So the law school has designated some courses with a DEI designation, but those courses, they're offered, they're not mandatory. And so people who are interested, and students who are interested in these type of topics, they, enroll in those classes. And there is some mandatory training and some other things like that, but course specific, DEI, courses aren't mandatory.
Yeah, and so what you're getting is students that are open to these issues. And so it's, to some extent, it's a self-selected group. And, we might have expected a couple of people to be in there for the purpose of challenging some of these underlying assumptions or issues. But at least in our class, that hasn't been so. There's a robust discussion, but it's been very respectful. And I'd have to say, based on what we're hearing, that most people at the highest level are pretty much in agreement, and the disagreements tend to be more, topic specific or something.
We are out of time, and I want to thank John, Joseph, Tracy, and Dylan for their remarks and their excellent presentation.